Hello, Elisa. And so, what I have for you today is today's lesson. Basically, we can continue on with the civil rights movement, take it up through the 1950s. Um, but before that, here's the joke of the day. So, what is a balloon's least favorite type of music? Pop. I don't write them. So yeah. So with that, there's no additional homework tonight besides the kind of long video of me going through some slides. There's some other videos that kind of go along with topics we're talking about here. Um, Remember, you do have that paper you're working on, looking at Black Power movement. And so all this information we're doing now is kind of baseline stuff of what the civil rights movement was before the Black Power movement kind of comes along. So we have that. You also have the do now assignment. The do now assignments are now going to be graded. I got the green light to do that. You guys they're actually a lot of fun to read, your stuff on strange fruit. So why not, reward you that for like putting it on Skyward. So that'll be based on 3 points, kind of like a check plus, check minus type of thing. But again, so make sure you do that, and then you've got the videos. Hope all is well and that you're not going too stir crazy. And yeah, miss seeing you guys, and talk to you later. Bye. Talking about the civil rights during the 1950s, and begin a little bit talk about the events of the 1960s. So to start, we have the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. The story here is that Oliver Brown, who is a parent, is suing so that his daughter Linda does not have to go to the segregated black school, uh, and instead would like her to go to the all-white school, which is located much closer to her home. To attend the black school, she would have to walk 20 blocks, and she'd have to cross through a train switching yard, which is quite dangerous. So he sued the Topeka Board of Education to allow her to go to her neighborhood school. This, of course, would mean that you'd have a black student going to a white school. This brings up all the separate but equal segregation laws, and that you were talking about yesterday. So this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and is argued by Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP. And what Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP do is they argue that separate but equal does not work. They argue that segregation is psychologically damaging. And attached is another video that talks about some of the psychology of this and talks about a famous doll experiment, and evidence of that was used in front of the Supreme Court. So I have that video for you guys to watch, and I encourage you to do so. But this is an interesting case. It took 2 years for the Supreme Court to really decide this, with Chief Justice Earl Warren eventually getting his fellow justices on board to agree unanimously that segregation in public schools needed to end. And basically, what Earl Warren did was he accepted at whole cloth the opinion of the NAACP and saw this as psychologically damaging. And so the Supreme Court decides that school segregation must end, and it must end with all deliberate speed. And that's the key phrase, all deliberate speed. What does that word deliberate mean? Some states drag their heels. Some states moved very quickly. The first place where this is really going to be tested was going to be in Little Rock, Arkansas, and at Little Rock Central High School. And Little Rock Central decided that they were going to segregate their high school, and they were going to start with their senior class with 9 students of the senior class and have them and see if that works. And you start with the seniors because if it does not work, well, you can say you tried and you've graduated them out. So needless to say, this does not go well. In Little Rock, we have massive demonstrations against the integration of the school. The governor of Arkansas is a gentleman by the name of Orville Faubus. Orville Faubus uses this as kind of like a re-election tool. He mobilizes the Arkansas National Guard, and has the Arkansas National Guard basically station themselves around the high school, and so to prevent students from entering. Included with the classwork documents is a reading by Elizabeth Eckford, who you see here in the picture. She's the black woman with the sunglasses. And so she talks about this experience, trying to get into the school for the first time. Eventually, President Eisenhower has to get involved, and Eisenhower nationalizes the Arkansas National Guard, meaning he takes them over. He also sends troops of the 101st Airborne into Arkansas to uphold the Supreme Court order. It is the first time that troops have entered the South since Reconstruction. And you see this image here of, again, federal troops, bayonets fixed, helmets, escorting students into the building. And again, as they escort them into the building, that's as far as they go. At that point, those students are kind of on their own. And you can imagine what that experience would have been like in that school. The bravery of these 9 particular individuals. It's also talking about regular individuals. We have the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956. And so Montgomery is in Alabama, and one of the many problems in Montgomery is the public bus system, which is you have white drivers, and the passengers on these buses are primarily black. And they talk about the daily indignity of using public transport. Blacks would have to use the front door to pay, but they weren't allowed to enter the bus through the front door. They'd have to enter the bus through the back door. Black passengers were told to fill the bus from the back towards the front. White passengers sat in the bus from the front towards the back. The first several rows were designated as white only, and if more whites were on the bus than there were seats, then and the first couple of rows of black seating would have to give up their seat to white passengers. And then enter Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks gets on a bus. She sits down near the white-only section. Her seats are needed. The driver asks her to move. She refuses. When she's asked why does she refuse, she simply says she is tired. And so she's promptly arrested. The black community is indignant about this. They want to do something about it. And so they organize a boycott through their churches. And basically to run this boycott, they need someone as the point person, as a leadership. And they select a new pastor to town, a gentleman who's just arrived from Atlanta named Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King takes over the Montgomery bus boycott basically because he is new in town. He isn't connected to all the other cliques of the other black churches. You have rivalries within those black churches. Since he's new, he doesn't have any other allegiances to anybody. And so as a result, people feel like he's a safe person to kind of, organize this. And so initially, the boycott was only going to be for one day. And it was successful for one day. People felt good about it. They gathered in their churches that night, and leadership wanted to call it off. You flexed your muscles. You show what you can do. And the parishioners say, no, we want to keep doing this. We felt great doing this, and they wanted to keep going. And so they organize, carpools. They start walking to work. And it goes on day after day after day. And what actually assists and helps out with this movement is that a lot of these blacks need the buses to go to work, and they're working for white families and white store owners. Well, if the blacks don't show up to work, nothing's going to get done. So you actually have instances of white, housewives driving into black neighborhoods to pick up their maids and drive them back to work, thus helping the boycott. This boycott goes on for well over a year. It only ends after 381 days. And after 381 days, the public busing authority in Montgomery has lost so much money. They need to negotiate. They sit down with Martin Luther King, and buses then are desegregated. It is a huge win for the civil rights movement. And it outlines basically the tactics of Martin Luther King, nonviolent civil disobedience, that they will challenge these laws. They will break these laws. They will do so rooted in a Christian faith. And they will do this in mass. And it will bring about change. It takes a while. Again, it took 381 days to do this. So imagine the fortitude of these people for 381 days in all kinds of weather, through all kinds of abuse, walking, police harassment, pulling people over, arresting them for having too many people in a car for carpools. But they persevered. And through that, Martin Luther King now emerges as the leader of the civil rights movement after this tremendous victory. With the election of 1960, Martin Luther King decides to get African Americans involved, and they endorse John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy actually runs on a platform promising changes in civil rights. And Kennedy wins in a narrow election. He wins with Southern Democratic support. So the Democrats are the dominant party in the South. And so while he does have a Democratic Congress, which you would think would allow him to get things done, these are Southern Democrats. And so they don't want to pass civil rights legislations. So John F. Kennedy is hesitant about what he can do or what he can't do, and instead focuses on other issues. It is at that point that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, decides to take a more active role in the civil rights movement. So SNCC is made up of kids. So these are high school aged, college aged kids. These are the ones that, were looking for the fulfillment of the Brown decision, which was made, 5 years before. And schools are only slowly starting to desegregate. So what SNCC does is they begin student nonviolent disobedience. And so this is sit-ins at counters. They're one of their first things that they do is something called the Freedom Rides, in which they take college-age kids, white and black. They board buses in the North and drive through the South. And by driving through the South, they're challenging segregation laws, in which bus stations had to be segregated. With whites and blacks, they would try to basically nonviolently desegregate them, get off the bus, wait on the same terminal, that type of thing. And the thought was when they eventually got to where they were going, these volunteers then would start organizing voters and start voter registration drives and that type of thing. They are met with violence as they travel through the South. Their buses are attacked. Their buses are firebombed. John F. Kennedy has to do something. He asked to act. His brother, Robert Kennedy, who is Attorney General, he actually sends a member of the Justice Department to basically supervise what's going on. He rides the buses with the Freedom Riders, and he is brutally attacked. Of course, all this is on TV. All this is being televised. And Kennedy finds himself in this interesting kind of like push and pull. He supports civil rights, but he isn't sure if he supports the tactics of the civil rights movement. Because nonviolent civil disobedience, while the protesters are nonviolent, they're often met with violence. And Kennedy has a trouble watching these kids being bloodied and beaten on the television news and on the front page of newspapers. He actually implores Martin Luther King to do something about it. And Martin Luther King has to kind of wrestle with his conscience about whether maybe they do need to change their tactics and their style and that type of stuff. And so next class, we'll talk about Birmingham, which is 1963, and again, how members of SNCC and how young people bring about this change through nonviolent civil disobedience and how they're met with violence, and it forces both Martin Luther King and the president to adjust how they handle the civil rights movement.